Hello everyone, today we introduce the French Wars of Religion. The reason is I want to talk a bit more, especially about early modern warfare and even more especially about early modern battles, which requires a bit of context, right? We never talked about the Italian wars, for example. We talked a bit about the 30 Years' War, we talked a bit also about at least the armies of the English Civil War, but I have to make more stuff. We began talking a bit about the Armada, the attempted invasion of England. I have something incoming about the Conquistadores. So I think that in order to lay the foundations for this further insight analysis on early modern warfare that we dealt with mostly in a comprehensive sort of pike and shot sense, even at some important level of depth, but not too much in this sort of more national guys, well, I think we have to start from here. Of course, naturally, there is already a series dedicated to early modern warfare, which, however, has focused mostly on non-European armies, or at least we have still to cover, say, the Spanish one. I think I never made just one video about the Tercio uniforms, military clothing, something like that. We never talked, in fact, even too much about the French army, just maybe the native one during the Italian wars. So there's really a lot to talk about. But the topic of the French Wars of Religion is even more clamorously important, as also criminally underrated. You hardly ever hear about it, or it's just one of those, like, at least for what I've seen, having been on YouTube for decades now. Yes, there's that chapter on the French Wars of Religion, but it sort of stops there. This was an enormous thing. Millions of people died during these wars, and that were also big in terms of actual military engagement, especially sieges of major French cities. I mean, it's just one of those topics that admittedly is very complicated in an evidential sense. We will see it today because we will not actually describe in detail the entire sort of military history of it, because it's very complicated, right? As you know, scholars even debate on how many actual wars there were, because they were a bit like continuous war truce, then war breaks out again, sides change. There is a terrible situation that, of course, is the general background of how France had come to this breaking point. Literally, France has historically these big shifts, right? At these moments of crisis, an enormous system. Think about the Jacquerie, think about the same 100 Years' War contextual in that case, and then the French Wars of Religion. They're a bit also are like an outcome of the French defeat in the Italian wars. Think about later Fronde, then various revolutions that could even break out in moments that you wouldn't think they were, but say under Louis XIV sort of was about to happen multiple occasions. Then you have the French Revolution. So this is a chapter that deserves a much greater attention than it is normally attributed to it. And it's difficult to even talk about it, right? So we are in the latter half of the 16th century. And what we're looking at are, of course, wars of religion, but if you were just to describe them politically, they were pertaining to France, a series of ravaging civil wars in the country. Of course, the primary impetus behind this conflict was the spread of the Protestant challenge to the dominance of the Catholic Church. Right? We never talked too much about Protestantism. I haven't created like a series of basic manualistic history about the Renaissance, early modern history, and we addressed the Catholic mostly issue and how, by reflection, sort of the Protestant one can be defined. This was a terrifying time in history. Like, there is all a progressistic, positivistic chunk of Western historiography that says, the Renaissance, what a beautiful period. people were freeing themselves, like everything was growing providentially and fortunately and happily. This, especially the 16th century, was one of the single most traumatically violent, nightmarish, and devastatingly horrifying centuries in the entire history of mankind. Right? What we think in this sense as the Renaissance was actually a moment of terrible anxiety, of sort of lack of a center. Even if you wonder where Baroque later in its beauty comes from, it's in this sort of shattering of the world that actually did not care much about things like, I don't know, the discovery of the Americas. This was sort of a secondary thing. What Europeans were rightfully obsessed and traumatized with and by respectively was the fracture of Catholic unity. And this devastating series of wars that had struck a bit everywhere, Italy, Germany, Flanders, that were still going on, of course, throughout, depending on which we're talking about during this period. France has these devastating ones. And the problem politically, when you realize what, say, Catherine de' Medici was about, what Henry II, what Francis I in perspective had tried to be doing, is objectively like a real puzzle, because how do you cope with the very limited coercive means of the time, the spread of such ideas in a world that is sort of fractured in a traditional sense, right? This is a very complicated thing to do. This is also modernity. But it's also, in the case of France at least, a proof that, after all, things can remain well grounded and still surviving and going on, right? What Henry IV, even as a former and probably lifelong Protestant, despite of the conversion, the aberrations of Protestantism, conversion to Catholicism, and of course what happened under Louis XIII and figures like Richelieu or Mazzarino, and then eventually Louis XIV, is the proof of the solidity of the French state. Is a leitmotif on Schwerpunkt. Like whenever I talk about French history, you know that there is all conviction of the actual continuity of the, say, monarchy since Merovingian times, of course, with the necessary distinctions over the centuries, but that cannot also be denied as a sort of ultimately civilizational success of this country and how it coped, even with this incredibly violent, like the French wars of religion meet with a level of bloodshed and ferocity and hatred that, again, just by itself should be celebrated at least as the one of the 30 Years' War, in a sense has been even overly sort of inflated. But, of course, we're looking at incredibly serious and turbulent moments for all of Europe. Like Protestantism, for example, was at its historical peak, right? And the situation was quite balanced. Had the Spanish, for example, conquered England, Protestantism would have not survived, right? In Northern Europe, in other eras. On the other hand, there were times in which the same French monarchy thought, why don't we become Calvinists ourselves? Because, again, there was here not simply a matter of, okay, let's choose one or the other depending on what we have in mind. These were constantly and heavily pressed by different groups that we will illustrate now that really were cornering the same monarchy. And the figures involved are really fascinating. A part of this struggle can be interpreted also through the traditionally feudal, so dynastic issues of the French monarchy and the French state. You can argue this was still essentially a feudal country, even though it had reached a very important level of statehood for the time standards. And so when you look at the French wars of religion, you see essentially a power contest among influential French families, notably the houses of Montmorency, the Bourbon, the Valois, and the Guise. Montmorency, the Guise were essentially Catholic, all except the the latter here were Capetian branches, right? The Valois were the current, of course, royal dynasty. The Bourbon were yet another princely house that descended from Louis IX, and as you know, they would become the French kings exactly during the same wars with Henry IV. There are interesting twists as far as also what the monarchy began to pursue, because at the end, with Henry III and Henry IV, actually the French monarchy fights against the Holy League. In Spain, it was supported. There is like all different layers like of political affiliation one must understand clearly here before even the strictly military dimension. And of course, we're looking at Renaissance warfare, right? Firepower was rising to prominence. This was very important also in a sort of social sense in a country like France that had historically fostered, as you know, this, in fact, sense of chivalric dominance of the nobility that still fought largely on horseback, in spite of the fact that, of course, by now, and especially the lesson of the Italian wars, had began to develop their own native infantry, that, however, had those sort of kind of insurrectional, combatistic, and sort of instances of dangerous veterans that were, in part, also Protestant and were, as pikemen and shooters, let's say, challenging the same primacy of cavalry in a sort of chivalry of the nobility in the first place in a country like France. France literally lost the Italian wars because it refused to unlock the practically infinite infantry recruitment pool that would have, however, entailed, in fact, arming these masses, right? This enormous demographic potential that France had, but that, again, would have meant having these dangerous veterans within the country who could use arms against the same elite. And France was that prone to sort of revolutionary issues, and you gotta understand that also in political perspective. In fact, the fortifications, the statistization of warfare in general, not just the siege one, right? The spread of the trace italienne, characterized by fortresses with low walls and bastions that rendered battlefields engagements increasingly, say, inconsequential, as armies could consistently seek refuge in these fortifications. This, and of course, like also the economical crisis we will see now, caused by the American precious metals that the Spanish were bringing on the European markets, with rise of inflation more. So it's really a complicated time without adequate background. Of course, we have just so much time for a single video, but I hope that we can sort of focus, like contextualize, in a contextualized way on the main topic and its implications. So all these factors converged into a conflagration that nearly annihilated France. Right? This is not an exaggeration. Never give for granted that states, especially at this point in history, were simply like just remain, right, or wouldn't collapse, or wouldn't undergo like a severe weakening. Like France at this point is also really impacted to a degree that really, where things seems really to go always worse than they should. Like there were grave political mistakes, such as the assassination, mostly of the Duke of Guise by Henry III. It was literally the worst that plunged the country into through that move in a senseless series of other wars for years, like incredible amount of people killed, and just for sort of petty rivalries and or like things that could be settled at least in another way. And so in many respects, at the same time, like France sort of bounced back from this war in a way that would pave the way, at least in hindsight, for her further unification as a modern nation state because of Henry IV's grandson, mostly. That would make France pioneer the next level of civilizational development in Europe, just like it had happened at the end of the 100 Years' War. And so essentially Europe having to coalesce to stem this tendentially hegemonic giant, continentally wise. So again, more background. Throughout the 16th century, as we know, the Reformation really would destroy Europe. Right? Martin Luther, former Catholic priest who called for the Church to reform herself, ultimately broke away from Rome. The resulting Protestant movement divided Europe into two factions: those who acknowledged the supremacy of Rome in theological matters and those who advocated for local religious autonomy. I'm not going to digress further. You know what I think about it in general, and there will be ample space for, say, explaining this both from a theological, traditional, political point of view. Needless to say, most of, especially at the higher political levels, this, let's say, the Protestant direction was essentially just a tool to sort of achieve further decentralization and also greater internal control, as a matter of fact. And in part, this is not to say that I demonize like these political moves just as they were Protestant. Of course, it was a total disaster for say, traditional European identity and unity. You have to understand the context, and there's no doubt, however, that some of these endeavors were highly successful. It was something within the single states that had to sort of break free to bring them to another level in their, say, expression of paradoxically Catholic power that, however, still sort of lasted for so long. And then had to meet with the limits the same Protestantism and the concept behind it, of course, like entails, right? And for, of course, a general fragmentation of power, overall not much of a consolidation. In talking universally wise, now the Reformation, as a consequence, had represented a significant departure from what had been the medieval universalistic worldview, which maintained that all of Christendom should be united, at least in theory, within a single realm. The Reformation resulted in significant political upheaval and military confrontation. Charles V of Habsburg, Holy Roman Emperor, reigning between 1519 and 1556, attempted to reunite Europe using his extensive resources as the bearer of both the Spanish and the Austrian crowns. However, he ultimately failed. And also about this we could say a lot. I'm a great fan of the era, actually. Like, I have some familiar influence that, sort of inculcated in me all the various sort of notions about Charles, Francis I, Henry VIII, and we will be covering, we talk about Tudor warfare at some point. We already discussed, in fact, some aspects of early modern French warfare. And that's a hell of an era. Now, a primary reason for the failure of Charles V's universal view was, of course, the French opposition to Habsburgic dominance. It's a bit like the great paradox in Pius Pandus, the idea that the French had sided with the same Ottoman Turks. So when you look at what happened to them internally, also to the detriment of the Catholic unity of the country, you think, well, it's sort of divine retribution for having sided with the Turks against the most holy imperial Catholic Roman power that, the French had always, of course, abided by, but also developing, as you know, a particular ecclesiastical autonomy, very much monarchically controlled. The Gallican Church, with its specific rights, like boundaries, and therefore with certain preconditions that could even, in fact, stimulate some sort of anti-Catholic belief, like in other countries. Except, of course, the Catholic ideology in France was very effective in order to maintain control on such a huge territory, this most fertile, populated Atlantic plains, and that had conferred also a bit more of an authoritarian character to an imperial nature, essentially, to the same French rulers in the first place. As you know, in the end, Charles V abdicated the throne and retired to a monastery in Spain, where he died. The Peace of Augsburg in 1555 granted legal recognition to Lutheranism within the empire, essentially Germany. Italy wouldn't have any war of religion except for the Waldensians in the Alps, but that was in fact a problem shared with France. I also made a video about Waldensian warfare at the time of the War of the League of Augsburg. But the issue had been essentially the German unification under the Habsburgs. They had tried, but under Maximilian, under Charles, things, Protestantism got in the way. And so you have the cuius regio eius religio, that is to say, the recognition, in fact, of, let's say, confessional autonomy, at least in what was still, however, a Catholic empire, right? And this afterwards, the Germans had by the beginning of the French Wars of Religion, already their share of their first round, let's say, of bloodshed connected to this disaster. Now, throughout the early 16th century, France was embroiled in that series of wars in Italy against Habsburg Spain for many reasons. These were essentially dynastic, but of course taking like a more modern character of literal wrestling over the entire continent. At stake was specifically in that case the vast wealth of the Italian city-states, as well as the control over the Papal States. Historically, France had seen Italy as just sort of an extension of her own reign. Francis I was literally obsessed with Rome, with Italy, the most precious manuscripts coming from the countries, almost went bankrupt, creating his own highly humanistic library of court. And so the struggle over this land, especially over the rights, the inheritance rights over Milan and Naples, that dated back like to the late Middle Ages, were like a very important aspect. It's sort of, as we were saying before, like hit at the same legitimacy of French monarchic power in front of its subjects. I mean, the Italian wars had been a big thing. They had eventually reshifted from Italy to Flanders, but they had just proven that France could be stopped. Thus, this wars proved relatively indecisive, right? At least the status quo, in a way, had been maintained in the general European scenario, except the Habsburgs had managed to maintain to win essentially the control over most of Italy. And this had also naturally greatly accelerated the cruelty of warfare, right? Cannons, arquebuses, combined arms all came to dominate the battlefields at this point, requiring ever greater amount of wealth, right? This new investment also military engineering, and so in the drawing a bit of the entire political and strategical scene. So that the Italian wars illustrated that the French were more than willing to prioritize their own national interest over any aspiration for a unified Catholic Europe in their own turn. Right? And this is, again, the broader price that they pay. All right. Because the same dominance of Catholicism in France was about to undergo significant change, seen as a divine punishment. John Calvin, born in Noyon, 1509, died in exile in Switzerland in 1564, a French scholar, essentially, converted to Protestantism in Paris around 1533. And the persecution of Protestants under King Francis I, who reigned between 1515 and 1547, forced Calvin to leave Paris, first moving to the south of France and then to Switzerland. In fact, it was from Basel that Calvin published the first edition of the Institutes of the Christian Religion in 1536, and the Institutes became the foundation for the Calvinist strand of the Reformation and had a significant impact within France herself. Indeed, it was expanded and revised in Calvin's lifetime, with the final 1559 edition being 5 times larger than the first. And the publication of the Institutes in French in 1541 had an enormous influence on the growth of French Protestantism. We observed in the videos about the so-called Dutch reforms how many Frenchmen participated to the Dutch revolt. And coming back to France with these ideas about the how to enact actually the Protestant revolution, if you want, in France, also in arms. This had all been brewing because, of course, sovereigns like Francis I, his son and successor Henry II, were quite harshly persecutory towards the Protestants. Francis I at the beginning was sort of like, what do we do? This is a new thing. But towards the end of his reign, he said, okay, no, we have to contrast this. Henry II picked on his late father's sort of intransigence and essentially enacted even harsher provisions against the Protestants, but without too much success. At least Protestantism was spreading among France, and especially, this is very interesting because that's where, in fact, most Huguenots, like the French Protestants, were concentrated, was the southwest of France. Actually, an area, as you know, historically, it's not just like it's like the heart of Occitania, but in this sense had some counter-cultural character and identity against the French monarchy. And there is also, as we'll see now, some sort of twisted triangle here, because paradoxically, the majority of Huguenots at this point was actually Lutheran. Like there's also a social milieu from which most people, like coming also from commerce, from the bourgeoisie, began to convert, right, to the, say, Protestantism was very radical and violent in principle, but paradoxically it would be the nobility that picked the sort most rigidly and fanatically totalitarian one, like Calvinism, for, say, political reasons. Now, previous religious reformers such as Hus and Zwingli had failed because they could not reach large audiences with their messages. However, the growth of the printing industry transformed the situation, right, from Gutenberg's Bible to Calvin's Institutes, the explosion of printed material catered to a voracious demand for information throughout Europe and beyond. Right. For instance, Jean Crespin's presses printed over 300,000 copies of Debrez's very popular French translation of the Psalms. There were these preachers that roamed, in fact, even the areas like southwestern France. The explanation why especially these areas were so more won over by Protestantism were political, were social, but at a point were truly religious and connected with the contingental spread, right, of new ideas, and how they first could be weaponized by the local communities for whichever reason. Geneva became Calvin's base of operations in 1541. He would die there later on. And this city functioned essentially as a Christian community under Calvin's ecclesiastical ordinances. Right, the Geneva Church Constitution implemented a new church organization, tout court. And as the persecution of Protestants intensified in France, many refugees fled to Geneva. This was another problem, that the hotbeds of properly like the spring, actually, the very sources of Protestant thinking were very close to France and were being tailored as Calvin's ideas really show, like production texts really show, around the situation that was taking place internationally, but they also looking at France, it was seen as, in this sense, also the most Catholic power that had sort of betrayed, in a sense, also its own faith. How wrong, right, confession was understood by the Protestants was seen as sort of the worst of the worst by this propaganda. By 1559, over 5,000 French exiles were registered in Geneva. Under the leadership of Théodore de Bèze, the Geneva Academy was established to train these exiles as pastors and missionaries to come back to France to spread the new ideas. And now in 1559, the Academy boasted more than 1,500 students, dispatched 88 specially trained missionaries to France between the same year and 1562, which was a lot. This was, yes, the age of press, but it was still an overwhelmingly oral world in many ways. So unfortunately, we do not know everything about how these ideas spread and how, say, the various communities responded. We just know that, of course, it was greatly successful. This movement rapidly expanded in response to persecution, growing to over 1,200 congregations and approximately 2 million adult members, which constituted 12% of the French population. Right, remember that millions of people died during the French Wars of Religion, so we're talking about a shared equivalent to the entire Protestant population. This does not take into account later persecutions until and after the final revocation of the Edict of Nantes, the Dragonnades. I made a video about the latter, by the way. So this tells you how intense, like this changes really were. The Calvinist-inspired Protestants in France came to be known specifically as Huguenots. We do not really know actually what it means. Anyway, there was a strong Protestant tradition in France. It would remain until Louis XIV. You know that also after the final expulsion of the Protestants, the decrees from France, this exodus that goes, favoring other countries that accepted these refugees, such as Prussia, right? There is all like some strong political, ideological, and even military implication around all this. Now, one possibility of, by the way, the etymology of Huguenot is that it derives from the German word Eidgenossen that, as you know, was the one meaning confederates, right, referring to the Swiss Eidgenossenschaft, that was the Helvetic Confederation that had hosted such movements in many cities. Huguenotism was predominantly an urban movement, flourished in this Huguenot crescent, which stretched, as we were saying before, essentially south of the Loire, in an arc from La Rochelle to the Dauphiné, so from the Atlantic to the Alps. There were some communities in Normandy, of course, Protestants were a bit everywhere, but those were the lands in which they were really prominent and majority as well. And while it is true that this movement transcended estates lines, giving it sort of distinctly modern character, it was still mostly a phenomenon of the emerging estates, right? The ones that were coming to challenge the rule of the first two, and that thus wanted to unhinge the Catholic order of the monarchy and the church, for how in France also they had grown endowed with particular power and princely status. But again, this took also like a remarkably vertical character, so that, as we were saying before, like paradoxically, were some of the highest nobility that would, of course, engage in such confession, and exploited the presence of Protestants among the lower estates and particular geographical regions of France. So writing different complex but ultimately unitary sentiments against the general order of this huge country and highlighting its imbalances. Previous civil wars had typically involved confrontation between different factions of the nobility. They had already been thus mixed with, say, general problems that went beyond the estate, and at the same time, the lower estates and the upper ones were ready. If anything, now it's the phenomenon, it's the level of organization and the level, if you want, of organized ideologism, the level of fanatism, and the increase in this modern world of the forces of a larger system. The expansive social base of the Huguenots would provide them with resilience in the struggles that lay ahead. The situation again was very mixed because Huguenots were present in many places, and say if you look at how communities were run by, say, the patriciate, by the nobility, etc., like you couldn't simply say who was who in there, but generally speaking, there was also like a boundary to break in terms of like most of this phenomenon was, let's say, popular one. So that at that point it was mostly about the elite whether to decide to side with it or to repress it in, however, an instrumental game that entailed, in fact, the broader hierarchy of the country, of the state. Another significant force, in fact, within the French Wars of Religion was the rivalry among the major families. I mean, if you had just whichever reason of fracture, of conflict, of competition, you could use the Huguenots for your own purposes. And we would never know, like, what even very important figures actually felt about Protestantism, right? Think about how much is being said about, like, for example, Elizabeth I not really being particularly into, like, fully into the Protestant hype, right? Because in many ways, like many of these rulers that also knew that the true meaning of Catholic tradition in a functional sense, not just like, okay, this is a new idea, let's use it to make a revolution and overthrow the system, right? We're much more aware of what that actually meant. And the English case, I think, is quite telling, because still the Anglican Church maintain, as you know, a lot of Catholic elements to it. In say a few extremely powerful houses in France, much like the magnates that propelled the Wars of the Roses in England a century earlier, but with actually much greater lower bases, right? Unlike during the Wars of the Roses, that was truly an elite clash. Like during those wars, like England was not really particularly affected or destroyed, or so many people died. It was just more like on a confrontation between single noblemen, right, of the various houses in competition. Here, again, it happens, but it is at a much higher level. The French elites are much bigger, more powerful, and they can mobilize much more. And so they were competing for power and the control of the throne by this also very destructive, dangerous means. We'll see now the major players, because they had also different backgrounds and purposes. The Montmorency, the Bourbon, the Valois, and the Guise houses are the principal players. And so blind ambition and mentality driven by blood feuds were the defining characteristics of their struggle. Right. So the House of Valois, Valois-Angoulême, held the throne during the first half of the century. Henry II reigned from 1547 to 1559, and he had been essentially a strong ruler. All right. Under him, like France was, holding in during the Italian wars. Francis I had a fundamentally successful reign before him, and Henry's wife, Catherine de Medici, spelled Médicis in French, born in 1519 and died in 1589, was a formidable yet ruthless queen, right? She was, however, despised by the magnates because, coming from an Italian banker's family, Catherine was not of the canonically noble blood, right, that the French nobility also sort of upheld as the most noble in Europe. However, the French themselves, also this is what had brought them to involve themselves in the Italian wars, had already married often into Italian houses that some of which had, of course, very noble ancestry back in the day. Think about Savoy, at least those were French themselves, but say they had, of course, shifted their power base in Italy. The Medici here are not also the main branch of the Tuscan Grand Ducal family. They were a secondary Urbinate branch. In fact, her the second wife of Henry IV, Mary de Medici, was actually the daughter of Francis I, the Grand Duke of Tuscany. She was, in a sense, actually a much more important person than Catherine, who, however, came to be literally the single most important and capable French queen, right, in history, even though she was Italian, because, in fact, of the dramatically unprejudiced and, as long as she maintained the control of successful handling of the religious issues during this period. She was regent for her 3 children, who will all come as prophesied to her to rule, but all ending badly in different ways, and paving the way to the next, as we'll see now, pretendant to the throne, the Bourbon, right, Henry IV, known as of Navarre. This was, again, descending from the sister of Francis I, as we will see better. Henry II's long and devastating wars with Spain necessitated funds. The Medici family were exceptionally wealthy, and so this marriage had been very convenient for the French crown. The Medicis were willing and did pay handsomely to become part of the family of the King of France. And as we'll see, Catherine will definitely fight for maintaining that control, making her family going ahead, but essentially her children ruined it all, especially the last, Henry III. Now, while Henry II was a good leader, his sons, in fact, as and therefore potential successors, were not. Henry II's untimely death in 1559 transferred the throne to Francis II, who reigned for just 1 year. He ruled between 1559 and 1560. In fact, his health deteriorated and he ultimately died from an ear infection. This was the time of his brother, Charles, who came to rule as Charles IX between 1560 and 1574. Except he was a minor at the time, so that his mother, Catherine, was entrusted with his regency. Even after he reached adulthood, Charles proved to be a weak leader. Finally, Henry II's third son, Henry III, ruling between 1574 and 1589, would be like the final straw, disaster, and like we don't know whether. Like at that point, things had probably become like exhausting for the same Protestants, but after like the assassination of the Duke of Guise, like the entire situation flipped. It was already that complicated that, of course, various communities would switch side depending on what was more convenient to them. He had sort of, also thanks mostly to his mother, managed to stabilize so much up to that point, and instead things went downhill, mostly because of his rivalry with, in fact, the Duke of Guise for different reasons. The power vacuum at the top, of course, that point contributed to the outbreak of civil war in France. Like Catherine, by the way, died shortly afterwards, the assassination of the Duke of Guise, apparently because she was heartbroken by realizing that her son was an idiot, and having seen like all these terrible things coming to France, again as a consequence of it. It was really like a terrible situation. Henry would be assassinated shortly afterwards, but not before having passed to the House of Bourbon himself. Like it was essentially shifting the monarchy to that direction and fighting against the Holy League that was supported by Spain at the time. One rival to the Valois had been, in fact, the House of Bourbon from quite a while historically. Think about the Bourbon who defected the royal side during the Italian wars, ended up being killed, cut in half by a falconet shot from by Cellini in Castel Sant'Angelo during the sack of Rome of 1527 with the Spanish and the Germans. And so the Bourbon had, at least at that point, being literally a state within the state. They had enormous possessions. Made a video about the House of Bourbon, mostly for the medieval times, but I think we hinted at, the early modern dynamic. At this point, the House of Bourbon had shifted in part, like there were different branches, and the claim of this Capetian branch was rooted in the typical convoluted, in fact, dynastic issues of the time. Henry II's owned Marguerite d'Angoulême, the sister of Francis I, who had also been scandalously become a Protestant back in the day, with her brother, like as king, of course, of Catholic France, had married Henry of Albret, that was nominally king of Navarre. It's not like they ruled over Navarre at this point. That kingdom had been fully absorbed within the Spanish sum of crowns under the Habsburgs. However, they were, again, one of the single most noble families in France, arguably even more noble than the current Valois rulers by blood. and surely endowed with vast possessions capable of founding a war. Now, Henry d'Albret's daughter, Jeanne d'Albret, thus Queen of Navarre by title, married Anthony of Bourbon. Thereby, like, this was equally yet another, say, the other family that could boast the same level of power, even greater, thereby granting him the title of King of Navarre, right? And this is, again, just how to explain why we call the guy, as eventually their child, Henry of Navarre. Now, Anthony's two brothers were Louis I, the Prince of Condé, and Charles, the Cardinal of Bourbon. Anthony nearly jeopardized the Bourbon family fortune with a doom scheme to restore the very kingdom of Navarre, but in contrast to her inept husband, Jeanne d'Albret was a formidable leader. She was, just like her mother, also a vocal advocate for Calvinism, and aligned the House of Bourbon with the Huguenots. And Jeanne's son, Henry of Bourbon, would become, in fact, the King of Navarre, the later Henry IV of France, the father of Louis XIII, the grandfather of Louis XIV, reigning from 1589 to his final assassination, 1598. Right. That's why, again, we know the guy is Henry of Navarre in general. And his cousin, Henry Prince de Condé, would serve as his loyal lieutenant. His brother actually would fight against him as the head of the Holy League, right, later after Henry III killed the Duke of Guise. Now, the Guise were regarded, the French court, as newcomers and foreigners. In fact, their origin was external to the Kingdom of France itself. The family controlled the powerful dukedoms of Guise, in fact, but also Lorraine, that had just, at least up until recently, not even been part of the French realm as such. So they had actually prominent ancestry. If you go back, you have also the famous Ethiconids from which the Habsburg also stemmed. I say that just because we talked about medieval Alsace the other day. But they weren't Capetians, and they had risen to unprecedented precedents, like triggering the jealousy of the same Valois that, as we've seen, had been challenged also by the Bourbon, and had this always as king, France anyway, this trouble of maintaining the nobility at bay as well. The marriage of Mary Stuart of Scotland to the Dauphin of France represented the apex of the Guise power. Why? Because Mary's mother was famously a Guise herself, and the family thus did not only possess two dukedoms and three cardinals, but also stood to gain a queen of both France and Scotland, right? That, as you know, were strongly allied in all this mechanism, for which, of course, the Protestants were supported mainly by England, right? And in fact, this country would send in troops and money to the Protestants throughout the World War, while the Guise were the true champions of Catholicism. Together with the Montmorency, they essentially were intransigent since the beginning, while the French monarchy, Catherine de' Medici and her children, were sort of trying to negotiate, repressing the Protestants but giving them some autonomy. Still, the Guise said, we don't have to give these guys anything, right? They were truly the champions of the Catholic French cause. In fact, Francis, the Duke of Guise, emerged as this national hero, especially after his successful recapture of Calais from the English in a surprise attack in 1558. I made a video about the Battle of Gabelin, in the background of which there is the, in fact, French capture of Calais by the Duke of Guise. As you know, this was the last stronghold that the English had maintained in France after the 100 Years' War. And so it was like a great, blow to the English as well, and this conferred the Duke with like this ultra French national mythological pride. That's how the Guises took on leadership roles in the ultra-Catholic faction, with Francis having 5 brothers and 3 sons, all of whom were either dukes or cardinals. Furthermore, the Guises occupied a critical strategic position in eastern France due to the proximity of their lands to the Spanish road, the vital line of communication stretching from Italy through the Rhineland to the Low Countries, which granted them, of course, Spanish support, imperial support, and also allowed them to control the main routes of attack that would actually occur, like from the empire itself, from those Protestant princes that at some point exploited the confusion taking place in France to essentially enter the country, not really achieving much, also because they were paid off by the French monarchy and or they lacked enough logistical support in local, but it nevertheless came to complicate the situation strategically. Finally, the Montmorency clan was really, it's differently from the Guise, like from a French perspective, a member of the true old guard, right? Having held significant offices for centuries. Really, we could make a video about the House of Montmorency. The rise of the Bourbon and the Guise did, however, pose a threat also in the Catholic field to Montmorency power and influence. And in their pursuit of self-interest, the Montmorency ultimately played both sides in the ensuing wars, like a bit everyone telling the truth. Now, the patriarch of the Montmorency family was the venerable soldier Anne de Montmorency. This guy had been born literally in 1493, so he had seen all before, the Italian wars and more. And he held the title of Constable of France. He would die in battle during the French Wars of Religion. His son, Francois, served as Marshal of France and as Governor of the Ile-de-France. So these were literally among the highest offices in the French monarchy, controlling the surroundings of Paris, and so having a massive political and strategical influence in the game. Besides, both of his daughters married into prominent Huguenot families. Léonore wed François de la Tour, Vicomte de Touraine, while Jeanne married Louis de la Trémoille, Duc de Thouars. The first couple, by the way, were the grandparents of the future Marshal of France, Turenne, in the 17th century, right? So we're talking about an office, by the way, that had been held throughout all the generations. It makes you really feel what these men were about. I'm preparing a video about the commanders of the 30 Years' War, by the way. Now, Anne's brother-in-law, Gaspard de Chatillon, was the father of the Huguenot leader Gaspard Coligny, Admiral of France, who was massacred in the night of Saint Bartholomew essentially by the royalists. So as you understand here, it's a typically French context as far as the political and nobiliary entanglement, right, at the higher levels. So the rivalry between these noble houses led to blood feuds that contributed heavily in the escalation into civil war of the broader conflict that was brewing the country. One such blood feud emerged between the Huguenot faction of the Montmorencys, because there was one, and the Guise, following the assassination of Francis, Duke de Guise, in 1563. That's an unfortunate strain of assassinations, as you know, that are a bit typical of the French wars of religion, because here we're talking Francis was assassinated, but the most, again, shocking, clamorous, and terrible assassination would have been of his son, Henry, the new Duke of Guise, that held Coligny personally accountable for his father's murder. Right, Coligny was a Protestant leader, and there was a problem also at the institutional level, because some of these people were very powerful, noble, etc. And so when a reconciliation occurred, the many truces that were signed to put an end, at least temporarily, to bloodshed, like these people had to be readmitted at court, in church, by the way, because as you understand, the religious issue was flaring. And so the part of like why, for example, Coligny was assassinated was evidently the Duke of Guise's memory of his father's assassination, and that's why Coligny was shot and eventually cut to pieces and thrown into the Seine, together with many other people, including women and children, by the Catholics in Paris during the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre. This massacre took place in August 1572. We think that as many as 10,000 Protestants may have been killed in Paris alone, and this is, by the way, a nasty occurrence, because this was occurring. In fact, you see Coligny was present in one of those moments of reconciliation, and also for reasons that were, surely there was a plot behind this. We'd never fully know who, say, organized it precisely. Of course, Catherine was behind this as just like the expression of royal power. Of course, as you understand, the Guise, that was also Alba, like you never know really, but there was a lot of movement among the people. Like people began to hate one another, these two factions. Imagine this pacified situation in which all these Protestant leaders had come to, in fact, reconcile with Catholic authority. And not just there is this massacre in Paris, but voice runs in many other French cities. Protestants are killed in that house. So it was a massive bath of blood with levels of incredible violence that, let's say, were, of course, not more in the individual merit than what had already been happening during the wars and also what the Protestants had done, but that when you think that were carried out so spontaneously, and also like in the city streets, and with this level of like indiscriminate, say, cruelty, like you understand how deep like this conflict ran in the French blood. Now the opportunity arose at that point because many Huguenot leaders were in the city to attend the wedding of Henry of Navarre, that was to symbolize with the Princess Margot. She was the daughter of Catherine de Medici and Henry II. This Henry of Navarre was seen as just like say the Catholics were not particularly happy with this marriage, was to sanction the the reconciliation. And Henry was also, as we've seen, just in line, regardless of this marriage, like the successor of in line, like for the enthroning to the children of Henry II and Catherine de Medici. So Coligny is killed on this occasion. Henry of Navarre actually survives this because Marguerite is aware of what was happening, and basically like the two wouldn't like them so much, like they would always remain friends, but it was understood that this marriage was not to be. But she decided to save him. He closed herself with him in the rooms while Paris was soaking in blood, and he was, in fact, one of the few Protestant leaders to survive that massacre. Eventually, they separated because they didn't really like it. They were not meant in that sense. They would remain always friends. Eventually, Margot died in 1615. Henry had already repudiated her and married Mary de Medici, the mother of Louis XVII, right, and successor, like, to the throne, to Henry IV. Now, at this point, duel became a national craze. Like, this had been a great opportunity for the monarchy and the Catholic faction as a whole to inflict a very heavy blow to the Protestant cause, like beheading their leaders. But this, of course, would engulf for a while further the country into civil war. We have hundreds of fights occurring each year among all levels of the nobility. The larger, issue was often called as a pretext for personal vengeance. Marshal Saint-André, who commanded the Catholic army at the Battle of Dreux, one of the most important clashes of the war, for example, was captured by a man named Bobigny. This guy had placed his son in Saint-André's household several years earlier and had provided surety and bonds for the marshal, which Saint-André failed to repay. And in his efforts to demand payment, Bobigny found himself in an altercation with one of the marshal's retainers, whom he ultimately killed, and in response, Saint-André had Bobigny tried in absentia for murder, executed in effigy, and stripped of his estates, which conveniently increased his own revenues. Therefore, it was no mere coincidence that Bobigny captured Saint-André. And it is reported that Bobigny cried out, "Always trying to defraud me," before shooting the marshal in the head. This is just one anecdote about the level of, again, of like a truly fratricidal violence that was manifested in this, again, literally French to French context. Another example, the feud emerging between Henry III and Henry the Duke de Guise, right? Their retainers engaged in an infamous duel that resulted in several fatalities. This is a bit like, not fully the time of the Three Musketeers, this is just the time of the generation before, but you know that the various households had truly the sense of honor, of competition, like the sense of the king being a primus inter pares that never really died out, especially among the highest nobility of France. And as we've seen, the Duke of Guise was like a hero of war, was the champion of the Catholic cause, and Henry III instead was so jealous of him, said they're not basically even French. These houses come to sort of put a lot of pressure actually on the royal policy that, as we've seen, was slightly more compromising with the Protestants, to the point that Henry, that was sort of a irresolute leader, orchestrated the assassination of Henry of Guise and his brother, the Cardinal, right? Which is terrifying. And this was, by the way, carried out by fraud, just per se. Like the two brothers were told that the king wanted to talk with them. They had been warned, saying like, this guy hates you, he wants to kill you. But they said, but he's the king. Like, how could he do something so unnoble, unchivalrous, giving his word and then killing us? And he said that's exactly what happened. He was stabbed into the heart. And by the way, Catherine de Medici was just in the lower floor, and she heard all the commotion, and she knew nothing of this. She came upstairs, said what happened, and Henry III answered her like, I killed the Duke of Guise. As if like it had nothing. At that point, Catherine sort of broke down. She understood that all that gigantic work that had been done in the previous years now of balance, of support, like, because the Duke of Guise, as we've seen, was the Catholic power, was the main support that the the same royalty, the same monarchy had in this war, like now was coming to be betrayed, to the point that actually Henry III was obliged to join Henry of Navarre. This, if you think about it, is insane, because at this point a Holy League, a Catholic League was established in France that was supported by the Spanish. So here the situation is much more complicated, because of course it is true that the Duke of Guise had ambitions on his own. He had already actually obliged Henry to flee Paris at some point, or at least there was a popular uprising in the city in favor of the Duke of Guise that was perceived as being sort of, hated by Henry III. That was true, by the way. And at that point, Henry III just lived shortly because he was assassinated, but he was literally in the field of Henry IV. And so it's as if the king passed to the Protestant side, even though on his deathbed he had Henry, let's say, at least he asked Henry of Navarre to convert to Catholicism, right? So it's not that he had abandoned the Catholic cause as a king. And Henry, if I'm not wrong, didn't promise. He said that he would uphold Catholicism, and later, how the thing went, he converted to Catholicism, became the king of France, even though, legitimately many didn't believe in his change, confessionally speaking. But this is another issue, right? He said himself, apparently, that, the French crown was worth, converting. And even after that, by the way, there was the Catholic League sponsored by the Spanish that in part wanted to actually crush Calvinism in France for the broader Catholic purpose, but also in this sense, keeping some control on what had been also an enemy of the country, like back in the day. Henry II, during the Italian Wars, had fought against the Imperials, the Spanish, and this was all an issue. For example, before the Massacre of St. Bartholomew, among the various agreements that existed between were being negotiated in this moment of reconciliation between the Catholics and the Protestants, there was this French, let's say, and generally speaking, mostly in that case, French and also pro-Spanish sense that had France just marched on the Netherlands, and basically Calvinism would have been, it's not about the Catholics thought Calvinism could be crushed, whereas the Huguenots thought that under a French rule, and this is a very French way of thinking, still those this Flemish Calvinists could be co-opted to their cause within France, right? And so also in this case, re-extending was the old and actually lawful idea of a France reaching up to Brugge territorially, because the County of Flanders, as we know, was part originally of the Kingdom of France, bringing to some sort of possibility of re-extending either the Catholic or the Protestant choice, but in French sauce, right? And at that point, actually, the king did not want to do that because they would have had to go at war also with Spain, telling the truth, to do so. So that would have been incredibly complicated. You understand how complicated it really is. But definitely the assassination of the Duke of Guise was the worst, because at that point, again, the Catholics had, if not fully, they had at least the upper hand. And had the war continued, there would have been chances that they would have repressed the Huguenots after some other wars, but not to the degree of the switching side. Because what happened now is that Henry IV was not just backed by Henry III, but when the latter died, Henry IV was literally in line with the French, royalty, for inheriting the throne, right? So he was the legitimate heir to the throne of France, except he was a Protestant, and now there was a Holy League that said, no, you can't take Paris. And the Parisians, by the way, were absolutely against, in fact, that, as we've seen, they supported the Duke of Guise. They were very much pro-Catholic. Like the entire northeast of France, if you look at the map of the spread of Huguenots, was practically all Catholic, right? It's that monarchic bulk supported, of course, the Catholic cause. And so there was a sort of stalemate that formed in the following years, which Henry IV actually set in his mind to conquer Paris. With war after war, the Catholic League was strong, and he could receive the English support, soldiers, money. Not too many, right? There were in all here there were different things. Savoy invading Saluzzo, even though Savoy had initially supported the Catholic side, and here all these changes had created a lot of issues, also internationally, because just imagine the situation, what the papacy was doing, what Tuscany was doing, what Spain was doing, to, in this case, support the Catholic cause, while there was like a king that was the legitimate one, but Protestant. And so the war went on and on and on until Henry IV realized that no progress had been done, and so he decided to convert to Catholicism and to factually become, in fact, the king of France, and putting things back together with a country, as we'll see now, that was really devastated, right? So this clashes take also the name of the War of the Three Henrys, because of Henry, Duke of Guise, and Henry III, and Henry of Navarre. The party known as more compromising, the moderate Catholic faction that the monarchy embodied, was known as the politique, because politics is seen as, the dirty thing that makes strange, bad partners, let's say. But at the same time, like, say, the policy pursued by Catherine, by her children as a whole, like as a balance between the two forces, was sort of, it did make sense, right? The others would have probably done the same. Also, the Guise, had they been in power, except they weren't in power, they were just pursuing their own sort of interest in that specific context. So it's really that complicated. Some people say that the war, after the death of the Duke of Guise, began to lose its distinctly religious character. It was the Duke de Mayenne that was Guise's surviving brother, ultimately orchestrating the assassination of Henry III in retaliation. One, say, exceptional character of Henry of Navarre was, especially in this context, the very rare ability to rise above vendetta and buy off many of his enemies. He would know how to compromise. He actually may have been affected by what he had lived through during St. Bartholomew's Day massacre, as he had been compelled also to attend Mass there, and this actually had brought him to be openly mocked by Catherine and Henry de Guise, the latter still splattered with Coligny's blood. That was literally pursued like in his room after he had been shot and killed, finished in that way. So this may have triggered some sort of repugnancy towards the most. This was important for French noblemen, the fact of having spilled this noble blood as well. And so, as strong as the feuds really were, was something out of this this clash that has to pass through a reconciliation. Otherwise, the country would have really crumbled. So this was true also because all these great houses, as we've seen, drew much of their own power from the same French system of patronage. So if they had just been killing each other, this was not a system like, again, at the end of the Wars of the Roses, in which like the House of the Lords was decimated and this favored the effectiveness of the Tudor monarchy. This was a much bigger system, and killing all the main characters at the top was essentially to weaken this ultra elite that was the representative of the entire system and had to prove to be able to respond to also to the needs of the people. Right, so while it is true that the French feudal system tend to lead to proliferation of minor nobles, there was a staunch difference between the top and sort of the lower echelons. Unlike in England, there was also no primogeniture laws, right, in that where only the firstborn son inherits the title, for example. So young men and women from the lesser nobility were often placed in higher level households at a very young age. They earned their livelihood by serving those households in various capacities. Furthermore, the nobility in France was tax exempt, with only peasants being required to pay taille or poll tax. This had caused much of these issues as well. Like in some parts of southwestern France, there had been literal peasant revolts during these wars, putting to death this or that baron, right? As we've seen, the main sides were all led by the nobility. It could have not been otherwise, but there were surely some instances of social renewal and hopes in this sense also. Like you see, that's where Protestantism really struck at the foundations of the Catholic hierarchy. By denying the capacity of men to contribute with works to salvation, there was no need to have any kind of rule whatsoever, right? No direction, like literally a complete loss of moral compass. And this is obviously very, let's say, attractive for peasants that basically, after centuries of oppression, think that the system is corrupt and or not able to defend them, because also part of the entire issue was also from the Catholic side, like, is the monarchy able to defend us in the first place? This is what had happened during the Jacquerie, during the 100 Years' War as well, after the defeat of Poitiers. Control of offices within the emerging French state had become, by the way, a new form of hereditary privilege. Families' control over these offices facilitated a spoils system in which offices could be subcontracted in turn. This was very convenient for the monarchy that had simply like subcontracted these offices, and in part this was, of course, an inefficient system, or at least one of, let's say, still based on like the relative, say, archaism of large estates. Like France was yet to expand in a truly maritime direction, at least at the level of other mercantile republican countries that were fueled by those Protestant beliefs, as well as, you know, the final expulsion of the Protestants for France was actually a very heavy economical blow, because the Protestants were some of the most profitable industries in France, especially like private entrepreneurship. So eventually, just because of Colbert's reforms, like things got a bit more on the larger scale, but not quite as competitively like in other countries. Subordinate positions associated with a particular office would then be assigned to a clan's clientele for a fee. This hierarchical system of clientelage provided the upper tier clans of Montmorency, Bourbon, Valois, and Guise with access to a large number of subordinate nobles who served as a source of soldiers. Additionally, the clients contributed income through fees and kickbacks. This clientelage system was often being credited with the rapid spread of Calvinism among the nobility itself, right? When a higher tier converted, the lower echelons would typically follow suit. And while this likely occurred in many instances, it is somewhat unfair to attribute the conversion of both Catholics and Protestants, of course, solely to partisan motivations, right? And regardless of these, France was swiftly becoming a divided nation. By 1572, the Huguenots had de facto taken over southwestern France, right? They had occupied many key cities, some of which of very great strategic importance, such as La Rochelle, as well as significant portions of the countryside. And as we'll see now, this was actually destroying like the very fabric of the country. At some point, the monarchy, you can see it during the various wars that succeeded themselves at the beginning. There was a way to simply like stop the war that was obviously extremely costly with a truce, even buying off the enemy, and recover some capital. At a point, the debt is exploding, like everything is in red, and wars like at that point are literally out of control. There are rebellions everywhere, and the monarchy has to find means, whichever they were, to control the expenses. And even though when we look at the French wars of religion, we should stress how important the confessional aspect actually was, because this was the true time of the wars of religion. Right? You can argue that, say, after the final revocation of the Edict of Nantes, after the Treaty of Westphalia, etc., like, yes, there were confessional divides, but these were sort of surpassed by a sort of different type of more exquisitely political, strategical affiliation. This is telling the truth. That's another myth to debunk. Like it was true later, as it was true before. These are true wars of religion because religion is truly always there, even in the single most secularistic or atheistic regimes you can think in history. The problem remains. Like Catholicism is not a matter of political siding or religious siding, confessional siding. It is a human condition, right? And that's what actually we have started to we have forgotten actually by this point entirely, but starting from what we call the modern age, a bit like becoming ever more oblivious and this is again not what we're going to discuss on this video. If anything, we will make a point though, that is to say, yes, this was a confessional struggle, but never make a mistake of separating the religious dimension from anything else, right? This is the reason why France was literally falling apart. And so you can spot these numerous intrigues, plots, and other forms of deception existing also both before and after, I don't know, the massacre of St. Bartholomew's Day, etc. But being just the reflection of that moral disaster that would allow also the narrowly meant religious confessional aspect run so wildly. And as you understand, France was just like a system on its own, and with very peculiar political and social environments. So when you look at the Civil War, you have to contextualize it in here. And so the power vacuum at the top, as you understand, had been in part just not necessarily because of the absence of kings that were always there, but for like the kind of power they had, the kind of choices they made, right? With Henry II's death in 1559, you have essentially Catherine de Medici's regency, leading to a decline in the central power of France. It was not much her problem. Like, it was her problem, like in the consequences, let's say, but it was not her fault, because she was actually very affected in that position, but still, like, a regent, a woman in Rome, first of all, is an anti-Catholic principle, an anti-traditional one in general, and this gives green light to all those who want to, in this sense, become regents for the regent that is a woman. It's an excuse, a good excuse. Catherine generally attempted to establish peace through, for example, the colloquy of Poissy in 1561, aiming to create a religious compromise of some sort. There were many, as I said at the beginning, the history of the French Wars of Religion is very complicated, much more complicated than I can think of any other war. If we were to talk about, I don't know, the English Civil War is not as complicated. Not even many other, I don't know, what had happened in Germany is truly sort of messed up by the political fragmentation, but in a system like this, you understand actually how traditionally many different communities coexisted, and so how also feeble really central power really was, even in a country like France that had literally achieved the highest level of statehood at this point in history, and also lost a lot of ground in the process because of this debacle. You can argue, now we're making broad statements, of course, that say both Catholics and Protestants demonstrated inflexibility, right? The Catholics were sort of the ones playing more because they had the upper hand, as we've seen it. So obviously the Protestants were the more extremistic fringe, and they were more radical in that fanatic sense. But as we've seen, in terms of violence, and also in terms of actual change, side changing, it wasn't there wasn't that much of a difference really in the merits. The Catholics felt alienated in part by Catherine's acknowledgement of the rights of the Huguenots, right? Because the leitmotif of all this, the various edicts, eventually the one that comes to be known as the Edict of Nantes, because there were many that essentially allowed similar things, were the normal reflection of a traditional reality in which that had really never had to cope with this extension of heretic institutionalization, right? Also abroad, because let's remember, here there is a Germany that is literally split between, say, Catholic and Protestant states, right? And that country, of course, had favored much of this because it was already very complicated to rule, right? France was more unitary. But in this sense, there was much delegated to, in fact, the monarchy in terms of not obviously going from 0 to 100 immediately just because Huguenots exist. Okay, let's exterminate every single Protestant that exists. This is not how they reason, really. And this is simply called practicality. As we've seen, there were this more intransigent Catholic currents captained by the Guise that were opposing, and that's how also the rivalry with the monarchy and the final assassination of Henry of Guise happened. Because there was a constant impediment brought by these groups in royal policy that had managed, after all, by granting some autonomy to the Huguenots, modest one actually, next to the repression, including, I don't know, for example, professing their cult outside of town and publicly and inside town, just privately. So even allowing essentially for the existence of Protestantism. Again, there had been thoughts also at some point initially, saying, what do we do about this? Because you see, you couldn't stop this. This is like a virus that spreads, and you don't have a vaccine for it, right? Once you get it, there isn't really much you can do, and so you're running within hoping that it will exhaust itself at some point, because making efforts to stem it can be even counterproductive, fatiguing you more, and you have to sort of accept this historical course, for which, of course, France was not the only country in which these thoughts were spreading. But of course, the same thoughts would have found a break, some sort of stopping force, anyway, in the Catholics and the general meaning that represent. So initially, they even thought, like, why don't we, as a French monarchy, convert to Calvinism? It was really thought. It was really believed. And many European princes had actually sort of accepted in this state of things, or even supported them openly and officially, formally. The Huguenots on their side still harbored deep bitterness anyway, because regardless of the degree of autonomy that they were provided, they were still enduring persecution from years. Now, Henry II's son proved definitely to be inadequate as rulers in this context. Their mother was much better than them. Consequently, also, there existed no check on the influence of some actors within this whole system, as we've seen also the most powerful families. Such power vacuum persisted until Henry IV ascended to the throne in 1589. As we said at the beginning, France had historically developed some sort of more authoritarian character, monarchically wise, because of the necessity of keeping with an iron fist this immense system together. And again, you couldn't really even behave much differently. There was also the matter of external interference. As we've seen, Spain had heavily subsidized the Catholic League, which is also, as I said before myself, sometimes referred to as the Holy League. There were many Holy Leagues, many Catholic leagues in history. And we'll look at them some other occasion. And as a means of, in this sense, keeping also French territorial ambitions in check, right? Spain was the largest power in Europe at this point, at least when France was so crippled. And this was the reason why, by fueling civil war in France, within France, and also for a cause that seemed the right one, because again, literally Henry III passes to the heir to the throne side, the heir that is Protestant, and fights against the Catholics. Well, even though he's a Catholic, so of course Spain says, we finance the Catholic League. What can go wrong? After all, there were still the Calvinists to beat in France, so it seemed like a perfect policy to carry out. But it was a way also to keep France exhausted and keep doing more or less what Spain wanted. So with the Frenchmen fighting against each other, there was less opportunity, for example, for France to contest Spain abroad. From the time of Henry's reign, so we're talking Henry IV of France onward, the wars became ever less religious in nature. As we said before, there was in part a reconciliation, so that many former enemies passed to his side, or at least he passed to theirs, and there were still, however, some Catholics that said, no, this is not our king. This guy has been fighting against us for years and years as a Protestant, refusing, like many people killed, like in the process, to say the least. Cities devastated, terrifying sieges, like that, like illness spread. It was terrifying thing. Obviously now also the economical side was a total disaster. This guy has accepted Catholicism just out of convenience. This guy's a Protestant at heart. We don't want to serve him, right? And of course they had reasons because of the foreign subsidies as well to keep on the fight. Without mentioning that, of course, Henry found himself in a sort of difficult position as far as he, by of course, converting to Catholicism and abjuring Calvinism, he lost a significant portion, to say the least, of his former Huguenot support base. It is true that his policy was thus more reconciliatory. He was truly, he was a capable commander, as you know. He really earned his chevrons there. Also, just as a great nobleman of France, he lived into this age that you see of confessional clashes that is truly like a very romantic one. It's truly one that would see people getting themselves killed, even as noblemen, privileged people that have all to live for, and that decided to stand for their beliefs. It's an incredibly important time in our European history, and we must talk more often about this. But at the same time, and so trying to reconcile, to bring the country together, still he lost the support of the former Protestant backers. As you know, it would be a Catholic zealot who would actually assassinate him. One of those who didn't think, Ravaillac, that was actually a pretty shady figure, probably also crazy, to an extent. He believed strange things. It was a mentally disturbed person, and simply stabbed him in his carriage in the streets of Paris during a traffic jam. But if you look at Henry's policy, you realize that his new coalition proved to be the most advantageous course for the general warfare. He established the Bourbon dynasty of France. He founded, in this sense, a generation of capable, say, a lineage of capable rulers. Louis XIII wasn't bad. Louis XIV, the Sun King, presents himself without other details. One pressing issue that needed to be addressed, of course, in Henry IV's time at the moment of his rise, was the presence, of course, also of thousands of unpaid soldiers roaming the countryside, wreaking havoc. This would be a problem finally resolved only by his grandson. There weren't things like barracks, there wasn't a program for veterans or all what the nobility of France had been fearing was out there, right? That there was levels of violence that really were equatable to what would happen during the 30 Years' War. The truth that this had been actually the same situation in which another Henry II had found himself after the end of the Italian Wars, to an extent, right? When France's prolonged war with Spain and Italy had come to an end in 1559 with the Treaty of Cateau-Cambrésis, and which, by the way, while seeing France making no headway in Italy, still saw the acquisition of Metz, Toul, Verdun, and Calais along its northern frontiers. This brought back in the day as well Henry II to hastily dismiss his army without compensation, and many of these people would enter the ranks of the rebels later on, because they knew how to fight. They were, at this point, finally France had developed some native infantry, a large number, the Swiss had fallen out of grace in that sense. And these were people who knew how to fight for making a living, and they would contribute to the, in fact, further violence. When you look at the war entirely, you realize also like the chronic, for example, underfunding that the sort of still primitive taxation system um, brought to the government. Like France, until Louis XIV, was still, doesn't matter how advanced and how statalized by the times, but still a feudal country. Like it was an archaic system. It had, because of this major blows, also the end of the Italian wars, the wars of religion, like suffered a heavy shattering, right? That requires that a more unitary frame, right, to fix, like under a strong man. This wouldn't be possible, but through the relentless work like of the later generations. Consider that the wealthy nobles did not pay taxes, and any increase in revenues placed an undue burden on essentially the peasantry directly. This was France. This is the country in which the ancien regime had sort of established itself more firmly. This tells you also how truly powerful the nobility really was, but as you understand, during this war there was also a lot of popular movement and social instances at work. Besides, as we hinted at before, Europe was entering a spiral of inflation due to the influx of Spanish silver and gold from the New World, and the basic cost of bread increased by 400%, while wages remained stagnant, which definitely did not favor like stability, peace, public order. In fact, when you look at the vicious savagery taking place during the French Wars of Religion, warfare provided a system for redistributing wealth for the average person, which is literally in many circumstances would literally happen through traditional means such as looting, ransom, and extortion. This will remain a habit, as we were saying before, in France, because when, say, soldiers had to be billeted somewhere, it would be within the Protestant communities to repress them. This would go on for a long time, and it had been all over the place during the actual wars of religion. And you see how things how quickly they were to escalate. Like it was a situation, if you follow like all the political and military events, in which you realize that, say, as one problem ended, another emerged, and basically you had some cities that literally passed to the Protestants, that say the wars had begun, but literally like some of this, as we've seen, noblemen starting to command like groups of rebels, giving them weapons, allowing them to break through warehouses and seizing the same cities that they had their Santa Barbaras, or the artillery and defenses, and so this would quickly escalate in a situation which, especially when you realize that there weren't enough means just even to sometimes protect the frontiers, like couldn't properly stop, if not by some sort of negotiation that was never enough. Like you could find a lot of money at the beginning, quickly emptying the royal treasury just to stop the wars, because it costs objectively much less than fighting those. And at a certain point, it was literally no way to even stop this. And any attempt to simply just say to tell the Protestants, like, okay, we will give you some further autonomy, wouldn't bring too much, because still there was never an open, say, recognition of Protestantism. That, of course, would be satisfactory to the Huguenots. Excuse me, I drink a little bit. So you understand how unbalanced the system really was. As I was saying at the beginning, unfortunately, we don't have the time really, or the possibility, especially in a single video that is more like an overview of the wall, to address all the main, most important, say, political military events of the war, which is a pity. And I will make videos soon about at least the major battles of the French wars of religion. Then we will pass to something more in-depth, depending on, say, also what we can cover about the general French military of this era, because we have sort of introduced already part of this, and it's just the beginning, of course, but it must be done, say, for the entire picture, not just, in fact, the specific phase that is surely going to contribute much anyway. So, what could we say as a conclusion? Probably lots of things. Superficially, France witnessed the end of the wars of religion in 1598. I say superficially, not even formally, because actually there would be some outbreaks later on, for example in the 20s of the 17th century. So technically during the same 30 years war overall that France would come to be particularly involved in later on. You can also say that really these wars had been, say, not useless in the sense that, of course, like, there weren't sides that were fighting over something, but say as far as France as a whole was concerned, like, there was a major loss, right? Essentially the country was still standing and much depleted in the same position it had occupied in 1562. So there are more than 30 years of essentially continuous war, because it doesn't matter how, say, relevant the truces were, still the situation was precarious, was unstable. Like, psychologically it must have been terrifying to live in France at this time. As we've seen, there were many Frenchmen that participated to the Dutch revolt in the same years. It came back to France with new ideas, of revolution, of tactical insight. I've made a video exactly about that. And to tell the truth, they weren't going very far. I mean, here the Huguenots were always sort of the weaker side in the general sense, right? They could find their own champions, but it's not like the system was particularly responsive to the confession as such. Again, the bulk of France, the north, the northeast, was overwhelmingly Catholic, and there was no real movement in that sense that could shift the balance confessionally in the country. And as I was saying also at the beginning, what is paradoxical though is that probably this war mobilized the country to an extent that allowed the subsequent reforms that would lead it, at least on the path to becoming a modern nation state. It's only under Louis XIV that this really takes off, and takes off by a degree that, as we've seen, surpasses any other European power. I mean, the French state sort of survived the wars of religion and allowed for its further development. But it was very costly and fatiguing to do so, and the system could have fallen apart, right? The leaders of the Catholic League, a bit like during the English Civil War, sought to maintain a medieval system during a time when that system was becoming obsolete. This is an important aspect, because you know that in England that side lost, and in England it was properly the royal side. In France it was not the royal side, because the royal side was essentially Catholic. It would remain so, but as we've seen, was sort of being mobbed by the ultra Catholic fringe, and so the politics were just seen as we're the ones who were trying to make the monarchy and the state stronger, as opposed to a nobility of blood that still wanted to maintain some privileges that came with this lack of compromise with the say, those forces that were making the country grow. In this sense, when you look at the Huguenots, you can't unsee, of course, a degree of dynamism, as especially would keep developing in French, say in France, in the following generations, and that, as we observed, under Louis XIV, that revoked the Edict of Tolerance of Nantes for the Huguenots, like would bring to the loss of a lot of very precious entrepreneurs that the Huguenots had in France, right? There is, of course, the idea that the Protestants were sort of the more modern, technological, scientific, unprejudiced, and that would fly, to the moon sooner or later. This is true if you look at countries like England or the United Provinces, but if you look at other Calvinist countries like Hungary or Scotland, well, these weren't really examples of particular dynamism or modernization, to say the least. So also in France, this must be understood, like what was there for France to gain, like what was also essentially also the Sun King's dilemma, like what do we do about this, right? Because as we've seen, the monarchs at the top were the least prejudiced ones, right, or the ones that had that precise role of maintaining balanced equilibrium in a condition of pressure from all sides, because they are the ones who are at the top. In fact, what does the Bourbon do when he comes to power? He realizes he cannot govern unless he becomes a Catholic. And so it happens. So things actually get back together. So there is always some sort of reason of better direction that, in this case, the French monarchy maintains in a way or another, but with much, bloodshed and also mistakes from within. At least, again, Henry II's children were sort of a disaster. So you see how Henry of Navarre was a much better ruler, in spite of the stubbornness at the beginning of saying, let's trade Paris and the Catholic stronghold and against armies financed by Spain and supported by the majority of the country. It didn't make sense. He fought for so many years, but there was no headway to make. And you see there, you meet with probably the bulk of the solidity of the French state. That these were the house nobility of the kingdom. They were part of the same. The Bourbon were the same royal family. They would have known, and instead at that point they made that mistake. And by the way, you can. These are more difficult topics that I'm making them, of course, but could, in the sense, consider that there was really a Bourbon that thought that it was possible just to be Protestant and king of France, which would have theoretically also been become a possibility. And as we've seen, the foreign interference was an issue. Henry III was more than willing to oppose Philip II of Spain, fellow Catholic monarch, when it aligned with the French national interests. And so you have to understand also from the side of these unfortunate French rulers, the children of Catherine, the Medici, that there was also in there some logic, aside from how they handled the things practically. A Europe dominated by Spain posed a greater threat to France than the Protestants did, right? And the French perspective is a very important one to get, because it is that multi-millenary in history, and it's exceptional. And sometimes, as Europeans, like sometimes what the French do makes you face palming yourself for the level, in fact, of almost egoism that the country has. But you have to understand there that France, as the continentally hegemonic power in Europe, is the one that has more directly pressing, in fact, political and strategic needs. And as such, it brings it to where they think it's, of course, more convenient for them, because much of what they do actually is also, many occasions, what does make sense, at least for a Europe as a whole. This is like a controversial idea, but I'd like to explore it further in the future, right? Because a few countries in Europe have the same level of military tradition that France, right? Most people, like from the newer generations, think that France is the meme of the French that surrender and whatever, but like in a truly military historical perspective, it's not even Germany that embodies European military tradition. It's France, and by far, right, in terms of the history of its armed forces and the actual conflicts in which it was involved and the wars that they experienced, sort of the statehood that derived from that. That's the reason why they have the bomb, right? And that's something you may want to consider just historically, not just out of World War II, but of something a bit deeper. And in that specific circumstance, the ever-present danger of Spain united the French people in a common cause. Imagine, these are the years of Philip II. I made a video about the Spanish and the English strategies before the Armada, right? And imagine Spain that basically dominates in Italy with Lombardy and Naples, and is, say, at least has the possibility of defeating the Dutch, that do not seem, by the way, much of a greater threat, and in fact are about actually to wipe out the country, the only country that seems to be the one on which the entire Protestant cause in Europe depends on, which is England, right? Imagine the Armada succeeds and you're French. You have England, Spain, Italy, and virtually Germany, because at least the Habsburgs followed, in spite of the different branches, similar policies, and definitely the Habsburgs of Austria did not like the French in Germany very much. That was the most obvious direction of expansion, as we've seen also after the Italian wars. And so what do you do as a Frenchman? Will you support Spain? No. Right, it's the same reason why they had allied themselves with the Ottomans. The French did not like the Ottomans at all, but they considered, sort of anachronistically speaking, a raison d'etat to prevail on the broader cause. Like when they, they supported the Turks against the Habsburgs in the siege of Vienna. In the first, in the 16th century, years later, their point was, on both occasions, okay, let Vienna fall, then we will, as Frenchmen, get involved into Italy. We will get involved in wherever the Turks arrive, because at that point it's us that dominates Europe, and then it will be our problem. For now, we feel threatened enough by the Habsburgs that we will actually sabotage that as Catholics, right? Because, of course, both Francis I and Louis XIV, so the guys who witnessed the sieges of Vienna, respectively, were pushing for, of course, fully Catholic enterprise. They were both persecuting the Protestants and not giving them anything. So militarily, also the French wars of religion reaffirmed the superiority of professional armed forces. Like France emerged with a clear understanding that a full permanent professional army connected to the monarchy, and therefore the development of a system, an infrastructure that would essentially supersede the older mechanism was really necessary to be the main European power. The older feudal formations were too unreliable and lacked the training necessary to effectively utilize the new weapons and tactics. You see how, like in a generation, France will actually be updated. They would have actually very good infantry. We saw it at a battle. It's a couple of generations, the Battle of Freiburg. But let's say the cavalry and artillery tradition survived very much, and there you have the ingredients that Louis XIV will use, as we've seen in different videos, to bring the standards of a truly nationally unitary military, right, would become for the first time in Europe. In contrast, of course, a regular army served as a valuable instrument for a centralized government in addressing its adversaries. If you rely on the nobility to serve like the crown, and of course these noblemen are the first ones, like the Bourbon, to side with with rebels, just because these armies are sort of provincial systems, right? And there is no infrastructure to control properly the territory in a much more directly coercive way. Things are a bit complicated. And again, the system is as primitive still under Louis XIV, at least in the first period of his reign, to, as we've seen, send the soldiers to be stationed into Protestant communities, which basically they were giving them, which meant giving them green light to parasitically live out of violence and oppression exercised in these communities. Being a Huguenot is not really fun, like in French history. Now, the French formidable rival within the Habsburg-controlled Holy Roman Empire demonstrated an inability or unwillingness to learn these lessons. Like the empire disintegrated amid competing religious and national interests. This is a serious problem because the Habsburgs in the first half of the 16th century were significantly powerful. I mean, speaking of the German base, they had some sort of regional power, right? They intervened, heavily in the Italian wars. They fought a lot in the same Germany. They lost that war, as we've seen. And so in the second half of the 16th century, they weren't faring that well. They even split again into branches, like they had managed to fix since the mid 15th century. And so even at the threshold of the 30 Years' War, like the system was incredibly rudimentary. And essentially Germany would not achieve, of course, unification until 3 centuries later, and not under the Habsburgs, but the latter wouldn't actually develop a modern system like Louis XIV's one until Maria Theresia's reign, and they sort of began to wake up in terms of having something similar to France was having already from the first half of the 17th century, at the time of Montecuccoli and Prince Eugene. Spain would, we have to talk more about Spanish history. It's maybe banal to say that it would forfeit its status as a great power. But here we're talking about France, and so when you look at the end of the wars of religion, that would have all a series of, consequences, including, like, if you look at the Fronde, for example, it's not much of a confessional issue anymore, but if you look at the dynamics like of French power, the level of instability, the revolutionary power of the French people. That's something, again, doesn't happen for the first time in 1789. That was a very concrete risk at different times of French history, and it did break out. There were real revolutions breaking out also under Louis XIV's reign, and there are interesting books about this. This shows you also how we see how that actually went in parallel with the effort of the French monarchy to build something greater. This is deep. It's also a double-edged sword, because if you hadn't had a Louis XIV, you wouldn't have had even a French Revolution later, right? So it's always at the limit, right? All these powers are all at the limit. It's absolutely normal. And this is something that doesn't end until essentially the Industrial Revolution, because the level of stability is incredibly precarious, even for the major powers in Europe and the rest of the world, of course. But you can argue that with the end of the French Wars of Religion, and so under the rule of Henry IV, successors, also under the one of Henry IV in perspective, so Louis XIII, Louis XIV, France would truly acquire that continentally hegemonic role that we mostly just know of historically, and we sort of, as military historians, also celebrate, as I was saying before, in a way that doesn't seem to have made much of a headway into pop culture, at least to the degree it deserves, because in part because of a mentality that does stem out of that silly provincialization of national identities that the Protestant Reform caused. Like, instead of concentrating of a unitary Catholic power, a truly holy Roman apostolic and imperial power, like the idea is, I will study just what my country did. Why? I don't know. Also because, of course, studying just what your country did means that you, by definition, don't know anything about your country, because what kind of quality or value do you give to something that you can't even compare to the rest? Nobody knows. And so this unfortunately leaves us with the unfortunate moral, cultural, political issues that wars like the one of religion, the wars of religion in France, and many others were being fought at this point, really impacted the world. And this is again terrible and sad, and it's a chapter in Western history that I think people should look at with a much greater conscience and saying, what the hell was going on? Because when you look at even at a war like this, you realize that if you focus on the single sides without context, it seems to you that it depends really where the right direction was. This is not important, like who did what exactly. This is about what kind of line the path, the trend was following. So as I was saying before, some Protestant countries, for example, succeeded particularly, and even in ways that one could debate in, say, depending on the context, on the timeline, and so on. But that, let's say, in fact, did bring to a limitation of the creation of a much greater power that could truly restore order, peace, and also prosperity as a bigger power capable of exercising itself all over, like reuniting, for example, the church, reconquering Constantinople, like controlling an unprecedented level of power, and that instead was not ever unitarily reachieved. right? And this is an issue. Also because none of these countries really managed eventually to recreate the empire themselves. This applies to everybody. They all failed, right? Up to today, right? Even the greatest powers never went as close as being one power, the power, right? And that perspective is truly the one that we need to reappreciate. And I think that the French wars of religion are actually one of the best grounds to actually do this, right? To actually try this, and that's something really you wanna consider more. So again, I will make likely some battle video about the main clashes of the wars, the French wars of religion, and let's again stiffen a bit the relevance of this chapter historically, because it's we are in need of examples like this, of stories like this, and we will surely enter in some greater depth on different videos. For today, however, I stop it here. Just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.